and pleasure to invite you all to the annual Mahatma Gandhi Lecture on Nonviolence, which is a key event in the Faculty of Humanities. The lecture is organized by the Center for Peace Studies, and this free public lecture is made possible by the generous donations of community members. The lecture theme this year is Truth and Reconciliation with Indigenous Communities, and we are delighted to have this privilege to listen to and learn from two of our very own esteemed Indigenous colleagues. The timing of the lecture is especially relevant this year as it falls on the eve of the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, a day created to honor the lost children and survivors of residential schools, their families and communities, which also coincides with Orange Shirt Day, an Indigenous-led grassroots commemorative day that honors the children who survived Indian residential schools and remembers those who did not. I personally take this declaration of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation as a reminder to those of us non-Indigenous peoples on this land to learn about Indigenous histories and the continuing impact of settler colonialism on Indigenous lives today, and to take part in events such as this evening's to listen to and amplify Indigenous voices and have those difficult conversations with friends and family that are clearly needed. We begin this event with faith keeper Elaine Henhock, who has agreed to offer traditional Haudenosaunee opening words for us. He is Mohawk, Wolf Clan, and the youngest faith keeper, ceremonial lead in Longhouse, and a knowledge holder. Elaine Henhock has worked with McMaster Indigenous Studies and McMaster Indigenous Research Institute's undergraduate seminar scholars program. He has also assisted in the Ohniganos Water Research Project as archival cultural researcher. Welcome.
You're on now.
Good to go?
Yep, so Elin is going to do this high technology. His link isn't working, so he's on the phone and he's going to do it, and I am going to run a PowerPoint while he does that. Okay, Elin.
All right. Hello, everybody. Scano. My name is Elin Henhock, and I'm having some technical issues at my house with connecting to Zoom. I'm kind of new to it, but they had asked me to provide a closing address for the meeting that they're having today. So it's just we do this every time we bring our minds together, and whenever our minds depart. And it's just Thanksgiving for everything that the Creator provided for us and for all of our well-being. So I'll go ahead and do that in the Kigo language, and then I'll go over it with a brief translation best I can. Dananda, okay, good, Dan. That's what time see us. Okay, when go, a while though. Name and way for can too. So go ahead, so go we can know you. Nene always up, scan not, run up the yo. Nene and we hate here, Scott and why yeah, and go and go ha. Scott and do that no hanyo, need to get your talk and go and go ha. Down your neck and watch your we, so when the gate. For no hot, now did one home clock. So get home, a way go. A high and toe. Don't know your way can scan no, hide one up the your home. Da and we hate, Scotty and what we know ni. On again and again, the Tino Hanyo, Itin Hua, when the gate, young boy, she doesn't drop where. For no hot, that one home clock, they were tough, way go send me a heart. They to get your tongue from what they go home. Down your neck, to Guadi and watch your we. Gain again, go gay, people caution go home. Nasanio, or they Hondonio. But not in the Dino, the Hodana and get on the Hondaco. Da and we hate the and what they were ya no ni on again and get the Tino Hanyo. They said no Hanyo, what to Nasanio, or they Hondonio, touch near gets at Nahawin and hit. It again your tongue from what they go home. Danio net to Guadi, and watch your we. Gaining with Dagi, I don't hear kill no. They can it, you can't, don't, the way go scan out that one up to you. They can it, can it quite give, they go, go, who did the boy show. And what they were ya no need, get on the night, get 90 no hanyo. Gaining with Dagi, I don't hear kill no, you can't, don't, need to get in your tongue, what they go home. Danione, Tagwadi, Ne, and Wachovi, Sibogowane, Skanadayo, Oihowane, the Hoden, and get touch water. It does a high point watch and also Goya hang or hand on how went to the donkey. Nedi, and we hig on it, and whatever you know, on again, and again, the Sibono Hanyo, Sibogowane, Naskanadayo, and again your tongue, what they go on. Danione, Tagway, and Wachovi, the home, who say give ducks and home, talk one jardí. Con hegi hand drops and go this song. It's on to set on it, scan up, I don't know, then you. They can had this nishagi, had this under gay. Ya something you put and get near her than you don't shot. Danny and we hig or net, no, they were ya no it. On again, and get the Sibono and yo, how hot get on her day, and now great away this song. Need to get near tongue and what they go hot. Danny told the guard queen, he get a guy get up. Neo hand on pay for this one, Konohano. Nedi, did you want eggs? Gaining with the gear, I don't hear a no. They go scan no, I don't home. Or some key artists and hunging what's called in your tongue go home, who can do on your dick with the winner. Today, and I get my governor can hit down it too. So that was the closing address in the Kilo language. And where we start out is with the people. The crowd that gathered, and we're just thankful that for everybody's well-being, and all our minds come together as one. Then the next part we talk about is Mother Earth. Yeah, that's where our feet walk on, and that's where the Creator planted everything: the medicines, the strawberries, all the berries, and all the trees and animals and the waters. Our sustenance, our food. So we're all thankful for everything that he provided us. And then we talk about the winds, and then we talk about the four beings that he appointed: the thunders, the sun and the moon, and the stars, and that everything that they do and provide for us. So the days and nights, that's also for all our well-being. So we're thankful for them. Then we talk about the four beings. They're the ones that protect our minds and keep our minds on the right path. And wherever we are walking about, they're always protecting us. Then we talk about our leader, call him Handsome Lake. As back in the day, people went through a lot of tragedy, and we kind of lost our way, and the Creator pointed him to bring the message of how we're supposed to be. So we're thankful for him. And then last, we talk about our Creator, say that we always pick up his love that he gives to us, and that we're always thankful for him, everything that he provided for us. And then we ask that the four messengers to protect us, protect our minds, and wherever we are traveling about. So that's a brief explanation of the Ganohanyo. And I hope that was understanding to you. And Don says she had the PowerPoint there for you to go off of too. So yeah, and sorry about the technical difficulties, but I'm glad I was still able to put it through.
Now thank you, Elin.
Yep.
Thank you, Elin. So now I will invite Dr. Pamela Sweat, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and a professor in the Department of History, to do the land acknowledgement and offer some opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Chandrima. Good evening, everyone. My name is Pamela Sweat, Dean of the Faculty of Humanities here at McMaster. As a settler on these lands, I would like to begin by acknowledging that McMaster University is located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations, and within the lands protected the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. We are here because of the hospitality shown by the First Peoples in this area, to the earliest European travelers and settlers, hospitality, which was repaid with centuries of harm and abuse. Rick and Dawn, recognizing this terrible legacy, and the fact that it is continuing, I'd like to thank you for your hospitality today as we gather on your ancestral lands. The Mahatma Gandhi Lecture on Nonviolence series was established at McMaster in 1993 and formalized in 1996. Under the direction of the Center for Peace Studies here in the Faculty of Humanities, the series is twinned with the annual Gandhi Peace Festival, which is held in Hamilton each year on the weekend closest to October 2nd, Gandhi's birthday. Funding for this unique public event and lecture series was originally initiated by the generosity of the area's Indo-Canadian community. And I'm happy to say that it continues to receive support from a wide range of friends in the greater Hamilton region. Also associated with the lecture series and festival is the Mahatma Gandhi Scholarship for students in McMaster's Global Peace and Social Justice Program, which has recently been supported by a generous donation from Ramareen Sahadeo. Those who are similarly committed to the importance of studying peace and social justice are warmly invited to make a tax-deductible gift to the scholarship. In a year that has seen numerous stories about the remains of Indigenous children found on the sites of former residential schools, it's particularly appropriate that the theme for both the festival and the lecture this year is truth and reconciliation with Indigenous communities. As a historian myself, I think the truth part of that equation is vitally important, and indeed, there really cannot be reconciliation without it. I'm incredibly grateful for the work being done by my Indigenous colleagues here at McMaster to tell that truth and to share it with a new generation of students and scholars. The lecture tonight is just a small example of the important work they do. Thank you for being here tonight. Enjoy the talk.
Thanks, Pamela. So now I move on to welcoming and introducing Dr. Dawn Martin-Hill. Dawn is Mohawk and resides at Six Nations with her family. She was the first Indigenous cultural anthropologist in Canada and continues to break barriers in education and research. She founded the Indigenous Studies program at McMaster University as a graduate student and recipient of Canada-US Fulbright Award. Her work with elders from across Turtle Island since 1990 has influenced her development of Indigenous knowledge in academia and in research. Her primary research over 3 decades is working with community, women, and youth to develop Indigenous ways of knowing that can be applied in resolving real-world issues, Indigenous pedagogy and methodologies, developing community-led strategies, holistic assessments of community wellness, traditional medicine, environmental justice, and addressing improving quality of life. Dr. Martin-Hill's current research includes Haudenosaunee access to clean water, traditional ecological knowledge, and creating bilingual tools to increase capacity in water monitoring in her community of Six Nations and Lubicon Cree, Alberta. She uses multiple social media platforms to disseminate scientific findings and Indigenous knowledge inquiry with and to community. Her Onegano's Water is Life podcast recently won a David Suzuki Ground Up People's Choice Award. She's led numerous community research grants and is a member of numerous boards and committees. Dr. Martin-Hill has been publishing Indigenous knowledge research since 1992. Her book, Indigenous Knowledge and Power, The Lubicon Lake Nation in 1997, documents the genocidal impact of oil and forestry extraction in northern Alberta on the Lubicon people. She has produced 3 educational films on Haudenosaunee healing historical trauma, decolonization, gender, missing and murdered Indigenous women, and reclamation of lands. Please join me in offering a warm welcome to Dr. Martin-Hill.
Thank you for that introduction, and I'm pleased to be here. I've attended many of the Gandhi lectures over my lifetime at McMaster, and more than pleased to be invited to do this for you. I think I'll dive right into it, and I do have a PowerPoint, and it's largely to keep me in line, as well as to assist, because many of the concepts we talk about are so foreign to our neighbors and students if they haven't taken Indigenous Studies. What you just heard from Elin is called our Ganyohanyo. And in that Ganyohanyo, when they ask us, what is our worldview or what is an Indigenous paradigm? We don't pretend to know what all Indigenous people's paradigms are. They're plural. For Haudenosaunee people in this territory, the Ganyohanyo is our paradigm. That is the laws we live by. It's said every day in school here at Six Nations. Part of your learning is you need to know how to recite it in order to graduate. So it is very woven into the fiber of who we are. And that links very nicely with Gandhi's views of the earth and how we understood everything that we could possibly want was given to us. And as he said, earth provides enough to satisfy every man's needs, but not every man's greed. And that's kind of what we're going to talk a little bit about today. In order to discuss the TRC, what happened in residential schools, we need to really look at the time before that. And that's what I want to focus on. And Chief Harvey Longboat stood at McMaster in 2004. He was a co-founder of Indigenous Studies. And the leaders that I worked with were really concerned about the environment. And he said the abundant material prosperity has come at a great expense of unprecedented exploitation of human and material resources and the degradation of the environment, which was going to hurt everybody. So the Thanksgiving address is our central foundation of thought and action. It is how we are to relate and interdepend with the world. Our cycle of ceremonies revolves around the natural world and just giving thanks. Our dance, our song, our stories are about giving thanks and how you must develop this respect for the rest of the world, an entire web of relationships that exist in our natural environment. So you can imagine, as Mr. Longboat and many other elders that I worked with, we're very passionate. Yes, there's human rights abuses and there's all kinds of things I will address really quickly, but at the heart of all of their passion was trying to get Canadians, Americans, going to the UN to beg them to stop destroying what was giving us life, which was the earth. They could not wrap their heads around why there was this continual exploitation. And his position was this vision of development comes from a people who have yet to envision an identity and a cosmological connection with the natural world. Division is generated by an image without substance, technique without soul, and knowledge without context. The crisis we as people of this world face may ultimately lead to a social, cultural, and ecological catastrophe. The people of the Americas must come to grips with who they are, develop a spiritual connection with the natural world, and learn to associate with others in a multicultural surrounding. And conversely, we had female leaders, and I worked closely with them. Our wisest grandmother tell us women are the water carriers, women are the first environment embodiment of Mother the Earth. From the bodies of women flows generations, relationships, both to society and the natural world. We are the water carriers. With our bodies, we nourish, sustain, and create connected relationships and interdependence. In this way, the earth is our mother. In this way, the old people said, as women, we are of the earth. The foundation of Haudenosaunee, what others have called the Iroquois Society, is the great law of peace, a constitution that organized our social, political, economic, and philosophical principles. At the time that the peacemaker walked among our people, which was approximately between 900 and over 1,000 years ago, it's debatable, but it was a long time ago, we were warring. Archaeological evidence supports that they were dying at great numbers, they were dying from war. And then it stopped. And we know why it stopped, because the peacemaker came amongst us and took the 5 warring nations and worked with us, gave us our teachings, our constitutions, And it was all encoded in the Hiawatha belt, which is a flag you may recognize. But for us, that is a very sacred symbol. These aren't things that mean a great deal to our people. The Great Law of Peace rested on assumptions foreign to monarchies of Europe. It regarded leaders as servants of the people rather than as their masters, and made provisions for the leader's impeachment for errant behavior. The Iroquois law and custom upheld freedom of expression in political and religious matters. So matriarchs, the clan mothers, uphold the bloodline of Great Law. Through observing her children, she knew which child had the acumen for leadership, kind, compassionate, intelligent, even-tempered, and really important in our culture is excellent communication skills. You must be able to communicate well with your people and they with you. So the men of every clan of the 5 nations shall have a council of fire, ever burning in the readiness for a council of clan when it seems necessary for the interest of the people, for the council to be held to discuss the welfare of the clan, then the men may gather about the fire. This council shall have the same rights as the Council of Women. And that's Wampum 95 in the Constitution of the Great Law of Peace. So we had women's council fires. We're just in a process of trying to revive a lot of the practices that were damaged through the era that we'll discuss a bit in a minute. But the foundation of our great law was females, and that was really lost in translation when the Americans took Ben Franklin, specifically our great law, and tried to model a constitution of their own. They didn't quite get things right. So our people understood the Klan, and this was out of a translation that we brought home from the Smithsonian and had it translated by one of the few linguists that could speak Onondaga fluently. And thankfully, she was able to work on this project and translate much of the material that was collected in the language. And according to these archives, the Law of the Woman Chief translation, we do enact that in place wherein the chieftainship of benign power lie in trust, every one of the clans which extends in every one of our several lands of tribes, the woman holds them in trust. This is very important to keep in mind as we walk through history. The chieftainship of the benign power shall be for every uterine family, the eldest woman in it, in fact or fiction, she shall be the eldest woman. So again, this is in the language translated, and it always doesn't sound the same when you put it in English. Gibson further elaborated that no one chief governed a people, but a number of bloodline of the uterine, that's the clan, matrilineal, and had 7 leaders and 49 of the at the time of the Great Law was established, specifically stating that woman chieftain has the responsibility to hold and trust the lands and waters of her clan, bringing the role of duty, the burden, and to work with her eldest warrior, who is to assist her in her duties. By linking the duties of stewardship to her warrior, implicit is the protection of those waters and lands within the Great Law. So the Haudenosaunee women had well-defined important economic, social, and political roles in traditional society. The central nature of women's roles is reflected in the record of the Great Law of Peace, known to European scholars as the Constitution. Haudenosaunee women have responsibilities not only to make decisions, but also to understand their direct relationship to the water and to the earth. The Great Law of Peace is the spiritual center and the underlying morals of Haudenosaunee, the basic principles of the law, and based on peace, power, and righteousness. The most important principle of the Great Law is the way in which each person relates to another. So there's a very foundational to our way of being, is our relationships to one another and to really the natural world. The Confederacy functions internally through the discipline of power, of the good mind, and the Great Law system provides for peaceful succession of leadership. It serves as a kind of early United Nation and installs in government the idea of accountability to life and responsibility to the 7th generation. So we were told to make decisions based on how it would impact the 7th generation. And this is out of a chapter that Dr. Bev Jacobs and I are writing. So about the same time the peacemaker was building democracy with the Haudenosaunee, the spiritual leader of the Christian nations decreed the doctrine of discovery. In 1095, at the beginning of Crusades, Pope Urban II issued an edit, the papal bull Terra Nullius, meaning empty land. It gave kings and princes of Europe the right to discover or claim non-Christian areas. The New World on paper was legally vacant, according to them in Latin. We grant you, the kings of Spain and Portugal, by these present documents, with our apostolic authority, full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the pagans and any other non-believers or unbelievers, enemies of Christ, wherever they may be, as well as their kingdoms, counties, principalities, and so forth. So here we are. These two ways of thinking are roughly around the same time in our history, global history, arrive on our shores, first the Dutch, the British, the Spanish, imperialism, and to our people, this was an apocalypse. To what we went through, and if you know the archaeological evidence and the most recent studies, this was a demographic collapse of millions of Indigenous people, just based on war, disease, and war, and then oppression, starvation, because they would burn our crops, kill all buffalo, so on and so forth. So this is like the really most worst part of our history as human beings on Turtle Island. So the sustained loss of life throughout this, people today are just recovering from this demographic collapse. The way it's being written about in the last 25 years is, of course, with more research done better than what was done before, is that this is a Holocaust. It's just not called that because it existed before the Second World War. So at the end of the day, we have dealt with something in a lands that nobody's willing to talk about. So before you can have reconciliation, you have to have truth. Now there's estimations of decline of 70 million. He multiplies them to 0.5 over the centuries. Between the 1400, 1900s, we get about 175 million. And there's a lot of debate, but it's between 50 and 150. So the debate goes back and forth, but it's certainly not a million, which is what I was taught in school, along with many other people. So uncovering these truths and putting it in the proper context is important, as they state, because you don't want it to ever happen again. And then they created borders that crossed us and our territories and separated our families in the Americas, and they came for the resources. And the last thing they did was they came for the children. So the Popal policy is still in place. So people who think, oh, well, that happened a long time ago. Actually, no, it didn't. The Oneidas took the United States to court, and it was actually Ruth Bader Ginsburg who read the decision to uphold the doctrine of discovery. So it still very much is a part of this discussion here in our contemporary times, because both countries are holding up the doctrine of discovery. So those are kind of the keystone corners of how we got to where we are with residential schools. So we went through these phases of dispossession, of genocide, extinction. Tribes didn't make it through this era. Many from this area did not make it through this era. And we need to know why you're not learning about those tribes. And is it just, natural and inevitable progress that they died, or was it because there's a genocide going on? Some of us made it, many tribes did not. And so bringing back and invoking their memory is really important in the healing process, to not forget about the people who walked on these lands. And it was more than the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe in this territory. So we had the residential schools rise out of the military system. Over 5 decades, they've been abducting the children by force. Parents went to jail if they tried to hide them. And as you know, likely there's a lot of bad things that happen there. Also, to make it very recent, we had sterilization. We still have cases right now that I've been working on with the Native Women's Association of Canada, going to the United Nations, going to the Genocidal Convention. And I think it's going to be in Berkeley, California this fall. So it's still happening. They're still sterilizing women without their knowledge. Canada had the first eugenics committee in 1928. in BC, 1934 Eugenics Committee, 1934, and the father of birth control was right here in Kitchener. And so while they had committees, we do know that there was pressure for many women, and they were sterilized. So there's something to this when you look at a Haudenosaunee people, where women and their lineage and their law and their leadership is really based on having access to your children so that you can raise them to be leaders. And all of this was severely impacted through this. And it did result in a lot of what you hear in the news, which is incarcerations, brutality, missing and murdered Indigenous women, no clean water. This is not all just an accident. This was actually policy that's implemented, and still today we are fighting Canada at the UN on multiple levels for multiple reasons. They only recently dropped the human rights case where they're fighting the St. Anne's residential survivors who were tortured. They've been fighting them and spending millions of dollars against that. At least they did drop that. So we're struggling to protect what's left of our families, what's left of our lands and our resources. The Great Law of Peace to the United Nations with a warning. And this is 1978. And if you're interested, basic call to consciousness, where they were dispatched to the UN to plead with the Western world that, civilization through colonialism was destroying the earth, and that they needed to stop because we were all going to pay. So the larger framework that they always seem most concerned about, in spite of everything I just told you, is the fact that we have a problem with the way in which they're treating the earth. And reconciliation is not a bureaucratic action, but a human one. In the words of Gandhi, our greatest ability as humans is not to change the world, but to change ourselves. So change within. And this is the foundational thought of the Great Law, is your mind. That's what they mean when they say a good mind. It sounds simplistic in English. It's very difficult to understand. What they really meant was a higher consciousness, a higher development of thinking, so you understand your connection not only to the earth, but to the cosmos and the kinship that you have beyond. So the thinking that you had to have was 7 generations ahead. And our greatest ability as humans is not to change the world, but to change ourselves. And I think that is probably what gives me hope, is that we are in an age of technology. We're in an age where we can share and do things differently, and we can now share our truth. And while it's a hard truth, it's critically important that we stop hiding our reality, which is what we're essentially forced to do at McMaster, is to not really talk about these things because they would be too uncomfortable. So we always had to temper what we were going to raise and skirt around these issues, because we understood the volatility that would happen in the classroom, and we learned how to basically suppress it. Now we have support to be more open because of the TRC, because of the Missing and Murdered Women's Report, that Canada itself is acknowledging that, yes, what happened was genocide. Now that we've done that, we can begin a real dialogue and healing so that our experiences aren't diminished. So I'll leave you with Gandhi's an action, not for the fruit of the action. That's important. You have to do the right thing. It may not be in your power. It may not be in your time that there'll be any fruit. That doesn't mean you stop doing the right thing. You may never know what results come from your action, but if you do nothing, there will be no result. And I would probably live by that saying. So I want to thank you for having us here today, and I'll be sticking around for any questions you might have, and pass it on to my colleague, Rick. Yaoi, Danito.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martin Hill. And we will thank you for waiting for questions. So after Dr. Montior has done his talk, we will have the opportunity to answer audience questions. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Rick Montior. Dr. Montior is a member of the Mohawk Nation Turtle Clan from 6 nations of the Grand River Territory. He lives at 6 nations with his family. Dr. Montior is an associate professor in the Department of English and Cultural Studies and in Indigenous Studies at McMaster, where he teaches classes on Indigenous literature, popular culture, Haudenosaunee history, and traditional narratives. He's also a community scholar with 6 Nations Polytechnic and the Daya Ha Hage Indigenous Knowledge Center based at Six Nations. Rick is an active community volunteer and is a board member with the Grand River Post-Secondary Education Office and a member of the let me pronounce it right, Onekahowe Advisory Group at Six Nations. He's also a member of the Super Crawl Board of Directors in Hamilton and sits on the Hamilton Spectators Diversity Committee. Dr. Montier is a founding member of the Old Council House Restoration Committee that is now undertaking to restore and preserve the Six Nations Council House that was built by the Grand River Confederacy chiefs in 1863. Dr. Montier holds a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada Award for a project that examines the events that led to the overthrow of the traditional Haudenosaunee government by Ottawa to implement an elected council system in 1924. Dr. Montier's book, We Share Our Matters, 2 Centuries of Writing and Resistance at Six Nations of the Grand River, was published by the University of Manitoba Press in 2014. The book is an examination of the Grand River Haudenosaunee assertions of sovereignty and social justice through letters, political activism, literature, and film. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Montier. Dr. Montier, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Chandrima. Sego Sewaguego. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our little talk this evening. It's strange to be coming at you from my basement, but I really do appreciate the invitation by Chandrima and the committee. Like Don said earlier, you know, having been an audience member for many years with the Gandhi lecture series and working with peace studies, it's rather humbling to be actually presenting as part of that series now. So I thank you all for the offer. But, you know, there is a long synergy and history of Indigenous studies with peace studies. It was we were both kind of upstart programs in the late 80s, early 90s, and Chief Harvey Longboat that Don mentioned earlier worked with Dr. Harvey Feit and Dr. William Coleman. We're now retired McMaster professors to make all of this happen, to get our program, bring it into being and build a relationship with Six Nations, McMaster University, which is still ongoing. So we're quite pleased to be a part of that. And I know when I arrived at McMaster prior to Oka in the late 80s, I guess, just shortly after Don, you know, the political landscape was much different than it is now with regard to Indigenous and settler Canadian relations. And we really were invisible on campus at a time when not much was happening until Oka blew that wide open, right? And I think I was thinking about all of those things when I came up with my little talk this evening, and the title of my talk is Sharing the Wealth, the Great Law, Crisis Management, and Unlimited Potential. Because I was always taught by some of these old folks that no matter how bad things look and can feel when we're in the moment, we always must have hope. We must always work towards the greater good, great peace, you know, good-mindedness, all the things Don was talking about earlier. And at the foundation of all of that were the words that Elin spoke at the beginning of our evening here. That was the first words that were given to our people when we first populated this earth, was to give thanks. We were instructed directly by the Creator in our languages to honor and give thanks, acknowledge all the things around us, because as human beings, we were the most fragile and vulnerable of everything on this earth. And everything that we benefit is you know, not of our doing. We have no control over. We can't, you know, make a tree. We can't tell the birds what to do every time, or, you know, in the course of the year, or the plants to grow. We can help foster that, but we can't really do that on our own. We must remember that. And I think that's something that's always been at the back of our minds as Haudenosaunee people, as Indigenous people. I have versions of that too, that all these things in creation are constantly doing their work. They're being responsible. They don't, you know, veer from their path, whereas human beings often do. And those words that were spoken is that reminder. Every time we come together for a ceremony, for sharing knowledge like we are tonight, we must remember that. And it starts off with the people, that we all thank and greet each other, even virtually. We've all, made the effort to be here tonight, and we're going to put our minds together to think about these things, some really important things. And just by, I guess it was just a stroke of coincidence or luck that this lecture was planned. It was originally planned for September 30th when Chandrima first invited Don and I. It was slated for September 30th until we realized that that was a new holiday, which we didn't even know about at the time. So everything has happened that quickly, but it's been kind of fortuitous that it's all kind of come together. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and sharing the wealth is just a bit of a play on words, attempt to be funny, because obviously it's not, we're not allowed, well, we've shared our land, but we're not engaging with that wealth. But as Chief Longboat stated many years ago at McMaster, is our wealth comes differently. We see it differently, and we have intellectual thought and an understanding of the world in which we live. That's how we're wealthy as Indigenous people. And those are the things that we've always shared. We've always been an inclusive people, maybe to our detriment, but it's always inclusivity as part of our cultural makeup and many of our narratives. And that's also important to remember. And, so this idea of the great law and crisis management, like I was saying, the great law arose out of time of great strife that Don was mentioning earlier. And, it was a way in which we were to deal with that crisis that we were experiencing as people engaged in warfare against one another. And then the peacemaker came along and gave us this blueprint to think about how to mitigate such things in the future, because as I was saying, as human beings, we're going to forget our responsibilities to each other. We're going to not behave as well as we should. So, but we can, maybe work together, put our minds together and come to some kind of agreement as to how we can, do no harm, right? All these things that we hear today, that's built into our traditions. And like I said, the unlimited potential part is to always think of the hopefulness that we have, as I was saying earlier. So that's all the kind of stuff that we were taught when we were undergrads at McMaster by our elders, who got things going at McMaster, and which resulted in the Indigenous Studies program, again, arising out of another crisis, the Oka crisis of 1990. So that was my intro. So I'm already over time almost, but there's a lot to talk about. And I guess that's the other thing I'll say, is that there's a lot that's packed into these teachings, and it's tough to do it, under the clock. And we all do our best. So what we're hoping to do tonight is just to present some ideas, think a little bit about what Haudenosaunee traditions can do for the world. We're not, we can't single-handedly, create world peace, but we can offer our little piece of that puzzle from where we are in the world. And I think that's important. If everyone did that, then maybe we'd be getting somewhere. And that was the thinking early on as to how we create all these things with our traditions. And I said, building upon the opening address, building upon that relationship to the natural world. That's very important. So I guess then to kind of really begin my talk, I was thinking a lot about Harvey Longboat as we move through this evening, because as I was saying, he was very adamant that our traditions belong at the university. They belong at home, obviously, too, to help our people and to sustain us and nourish us spiritually and mentally, physically, emotionally, all those things. But there were intellectual traditions in our philosophies that could be studied elsewhere alongside these other traditions. We weren't greater than, we were just a little bit different. We all had something to offer, and that was the important thing that he worked towards. And he was always very fond of talking about a university course that could be entirely on the great law of peace, the great peace that we're talking about this evening. He's always excited about the possibility that this course could be conducted in our languages, because at that time in the early 90s, the immersion schools, the language immersion schools at Six Nations here were just beginning. And he always kind of, again, as a chief, as a leader, he had to sort of always think in the future, right? So he saw those young kids who were, in grade school then, that they would one day maybe make their way to McMaster and be able to engage in these things in the language and English, to expand those concepts, because there's a lot of things that in our languages that are are difficult to translate into English, right? And it takes a lot of work, a lot of thinking. So it's fantastic. It's amazing that we're here tonight talking about it. It's a little bit at a slower pace maybe than we had envisioned 30 years ago, but we're doing it now, and that's the important thing, that it is taking place. And this idea of sharing knowledge and moving knowledge mobilization they talk about, that's always been our way. As I was saying, you know, we're an inclusive people who were very proud of our traditions, understood the benefits of them, not just for our people, but for all people. And when it comes to things like climate change and environmental, responsibility and things, they don't begin and stop at the boundaries of our reserve. They're something that affects us globally. So we have to work on behalf of all people. That's how we see the things that we do during the Thanksgiving address and the things that are in our traditions. We have helpful things to offer to all people. And you know, even this idea of the dish with one spoon that you hear often around now, and this is a wampum belt, the dish with one spoon wampum belt, very simple in its design. And you hear it often in terms of land acknowledgements now, where this area, Southern Ontario, the Golden Horseshoe, whatever you want to call it, was an environment rich in resources and plant life and animals and water and good clean water, back when we had that, all those things. And it was up to the people to understand that and work towards sustaining that. And I think that was super important, that we maintain that. But that began even with concepts in the Great Law, because in the Great Law it talks about how our leaders were to not, they're also to eat out of a dish with one spoon, you know, and as chiefs, as leaders amongst our Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And it said that we're not to have any sharp objects around around eating time, because that could cause problems if someone got cut or hurt or something. And that has to do with harsh words. That's, again, there's a metaphor in the translation, things are lost. But the idea that people's minds were affected by words, and they had to be careful how to use those words. So there's a lot of eating, there's a lot of metaphor in that, and the importance of that, and to sustain ourselves and be careful. And like I said, do no harm. These things are the things that we hear today, are things that are kind of built into our traditions. So this idea that our leaders were to also be gentle and kind and to be careful, also partaking in that dish with one spoon idea, right? And you see, and you look around now at the election that was just held last week in Canada, and the conflict and the harsh words, and that's leaders. So people see that. People see those sorts of criticisms and shouting and debates loudly, right? And that's the people have to kind of absorb that, or they don't have to, but they do, right? They follow the leader. And if that's not done in a good way, then the people will behave accordingly. So again, the peacemaker and this formation, the Great Peace, understood that the leaders had to show exemplary behavior at all times. And that was later translated in a nation, on a nation-to-nation level, with relations between us as Haudenosaunee people and Anishinaabe people, and that's where the dish with one spoon idea came from as well. So again, these are more cultural foundations, philosophies that have always been kind of layered one upon the other, beginning with that Thanksgiving address, with this idea that we all have to be responsible for the well-being of one another. And when Elon spoke those words, as people, we all greet at one another. He did it for us, but that's the way it works. So he's speaking on behalf of all of us, that we're all glad to see each other and that we've arrived safe and all of that. So all of that's, the very first thing is you acknowledge the people that are gathered to hear these words and to share our knowledge. So and we do that. That's, like I said, that was the very first speech or ceremony that was given to our people, who knows how many thousands of years ago, amongst our people, and we're still doing it tonight. And we layer our thinking circulates through the seasons. As Haudenosaunee people, we're agricultural people, we're also hunters, so we abided by the seasons. So we saw these constant patterns in the universe and in human behavior too, which, and I'm sorry, my internet cut out during some of Don's presentation, so I apologize if I'm repeating, but even things like the current pandemic that we're all living through globally, we have prophecies around those sorts of things. We weren't really that surprised when such a thing happened because we were told that such a thing would. And lo and behold, here we are in 2020, 2021, witnessing such a thing, as well as climate change and on, but maybe that's a time, you know, we'll leave that for another talk at on another evening. But so anyway, before I go a whole lot further, I would just like to present a very, very brief overview of the story of the Great Law and how that came into being for people who may not have heard that story before, and I assume that there's many who have not. So you might have, you know, we've been referring to as the Great Law, the Gayan Lagoa is, you know, what we refer to, but the Gayan Lagoa actually translates into Great Peace. We added law in there somewhere a bit later on, almost to kind of give our constitution, I think Don referred to it as, yeah, our blueprint for governmental thinking. We gave it kind of a Western spin to make it sound more authoritative, even though that wasn't the original intent, which maybe I'll get to in a little bit. But it's interesting how we sort of sort of played along, trying to make our understanding of the world more palatable or more understandable for a Western mindset. But so I'll get to that in a bit. But the original meaning of Gayan Lagoa is great, just the great peace, the great niceness. You know, it's a good thing that was given to us. The law has a bit more of a different connotation, but anyway, we sort of morphed it to the Great Law, but let's call it the Great Peace. And this emerged about 1,000 years ago. Our traditional territories as Haudenosaunee people or Iroquois people or the Five Nations, or what is now present day New York State, from the Hudson River in the east to the Niagara River in the west, and it comprised the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca nations across that landscape. Very beautiful if anyone's ever been out that way. And it's said that we began as a single nation of people who over the centuries kind of grew and transformed into those five nations I just named. Our languages are very similar in many ways. It's a linguistic grouping, but also difference within the nations. But our cultures and our traditions are virtually identical across those five nations. And our clan system was devised during that time too, as we sort of grew and expanded into these clan families. And that's important. So our clan families are three from the water: the eel, the beaver, and the turtle. I should know that, that's what I am. The land is the three clans are the bear, the deer, and the wolf. And the three clans from the air, which were the hawk, the snipe, and the heron. And so all of our people belong to one of those. And it's a matrilineal system, as Don was saying, is that we obtain our nation and clan affiliation through our mothers. And, you know, so if you think about it, that gives people responsibility for those domains, the water, the land, and the air. And that's still the way, you know, we still have those systems in play. And it said that that's the kind of guiding principle, even over and above nations, but there's a lot of interconnections there. And over time, we've developed these pretty intricate systems, which we won't have time to get into. And but even despite all of those connections, whether it be family or clan family, it said that we fell into a vicious state of war amongst our people. So bad, it said that we practiced cannibalism. People were afraid to leave their villages at night. Everyone was suspicious of everyone else. There was a lot of revenge killings. It was just not a very good time to have been living, you know, a lot of conflict, a lot of death, a lot of grieving. And it said at that time that there was a young man who was born in the North Shore of Lake Ontario near present day Deseronto, Belleville area, if anyone knows that area. And he was a Huron, a young Huron boy. And there's, you know, again, this story I'm telling takes about 4 or 5 days to tell. So I'm shortening it quite a bit, doing my best to summarize it. But an outsider, let's say, you know, from a different nation, not of our people, but closely aligned. And even then you think about how it is in a counseling session or conflict resolution these days. You need someone from outside of your immediate parties in conflict to help resolve that conflict. And that's what the peacemaker, as we came to refer to him as, came from that area and those nations. He wasn't one of us, but he was close, a close neighbor. He would have been known to us. And it said too that he, as he grew from a young boy into adulthood, he displayed he displayed extraordinary abilities, and people kind of gathered around him. Younger boys gathered around him, and he was just sort of a very special young man. And as he grew into adulthood, he began carving a stone canoe, they say. And when his mother and grandmother came upon him carving a stone canoe, they were a little bit concerned, and they asked him what he was doing, and he told them that he had a mission to accomplish on the south shore of Lake Ontario, and that was to bring peace to our people, the Haudenosaunee people. And they were, afraid, as mothers and grandmothers would be, but they understood, his special talents, and so, supported him in this endeavor. And so he came, he got across Lake Ontario in his stone canoe, and he came across a Mohawk group of Mohawk warriors who were out on a hunting party by the south shore of Lake Ontario, around present-day Oswego, New York, if anyone knows that area, sort of on the eastern edge of Lake Ontario. And when these Mohawk men saw this individual come upon them in a stone canoe, they knew he was something special too. They had to pay attention to him. But of course, they were living at a time when they were highly suspicious of everyone and were afraid, and didn't trust him, even though despite his mode of transportation. So he spoke to them and he said, I want to speak to your leaders. I want to speak, I have this message of peace that I want to speak to the people about. I've been sent by the Creator to give people a different way to think about the world and exist within it. You're meant to help one another. You're not meant to hurt one another. Because remember the Thanksgiving address, we gather the people, we thank the people, we thank them for coming. We're always sort of engaging with people's minds and welcoming them, be encouraging, all that kind of stuff. So we'd forgotten that as an example. Long story short, the peacemaker finally, got through to all the Mohawk leadership at the time and convinced them that there was a better way of living, which he referred to as the Gayanlagoa, or the Gayanlagoa, the great peace, great niceness. And he convinced the Mohawks to adopt this way of thinking, and we moved to the Oneidas, to the west of us. Same idea, took a little bit of cajoling and diplomacy, but they eventually agreed. And then on to the Onondaga. And the village of Onondaga was near present-day Syracuse, New York. And although the people initially agreed to the peacemaker's words, and because they too wanted to get out of all of this warfare, they had a leader, his name was Taradaho, and he was a very fearful man, a very fearsome man, I should say, I guess, that everyone was afraid of. He had great powers of a bad nature. And so they said, we like this idea of peace, but we can't, get there because we're afraid of our main leader. And so the peacemaker understood that. And he said, okay, well, we'll come back. So they bypassed the Onondaga Nation and went on to the Cayuga Nation in the Finger Lakes region, and then on to the Seneca Nation and, present-day Genesee River, Rochester, Buffalo area. And they had all these four nations. These four nations at the time were signed on, let's say, to this great peace, this new way of living in the world. And these four nations traveled back to Onondaga to convince Taradaho of the, right-mindedness of this new message that the peacemaker carried and all the people who followed him. And the peacemaker, on the way back to Onondaga, Onondaga and Taradaho's village, the peacemaker taught the people a song. It's a song that we still use in this ceremony, only used at a certain time. And it was such a powerful song that it said that when the people walked to Taradaho's village where he lived, that the snakes sort of, all the things in his bad mind were righted again, were made straight. That's the power of that song. And he agreed to this great peace. And so the message here is, and there's much more to that, but the message here is that the peacemaker said that, when you see a person who is doing bad and people are afraid of, you don't try to eradicate that person. You don't rise up against him and try to strike him down. You bring that person in. You want to address the worst people in society in a way, because if you can do that, if you can get through to them, then you can, everything else will be easy. But when you meet violence with violence, as we've seen in the world, after 9/11 and all sorts of things, where this axis of evil that George Bush talked about, and this and that, and going after Osama bin Laden and killing him in the manner that they did, it just begets more violence. We see that still circulating. So that's the kind of thing that the peacemaker understood, that you can't, if you put violence into the world, you're just going to get that back out. There has to be a better way. And so there's an example, and there's many, many others. Like I said, there's such a rich wealth of knowledge here in these stories. We don't have time to talk about, and I'm running out of time now. But I'll just leave you with that, the idea that you don't meet violence with violence, and that's what the peacemaker told us, because we've been through that, right? And I think that's what I'm saying about in terms of crisis management and the things that we can teach, that we offer up, that we can say that we've been through this experience. We understand what it's like to be caught in circular violence that just seems to have no end. And after a while, people don't even really remember why they're fighting in the first place. They just know there's an enemy out there. So the peacemaker asked us to think about those things. And when he brought us all together, he utilized a lot of symbols in nature that were important to our people then. The great white pine that still grows in this part of the Carolinian forest in the Northeast here in New York and Ontario. There's a great big one behind my house right now. And the reason he chose the white pine as a symbol of, that's the tree of peace you might have heard about. And the reason he chose the great white pine as the tree of peace is for a couple of reasons, I guess. It's because it's an evergreen, the pine tree. It doesn't lose its color in the fall and the winter. It stays green all year round. And if you ever see, the tree line of most any Carolinian forest in this area, if you're so lucky to have one close by, you'll see that the great white pine is quite often the one that's just slightly above the rest of the tree line. It just grows slightly above. And the great tree of peace becomes that beacon of peace, of hope that we aspire to. We can gather there. It's kind of a meeting place. If you remember the wampum belt, I don't have it right here with me now, but the wampum belt, the Hiawatha flag, or the Five Nations belt, whatever you want to call it, the one that a lot of people know with the four squares and the tree in the middle, that's the tree of peace. And it said that's situated on Onondaga, New York, where Taradaho village was, right? And that's the kind of thinking there, that and it's a symbol drawn from nature, and it's something that you can look to, in any people back then could have looked, in any direction and noticed that and understood that that's what that meant. And it said that he placed a bald eagle on top of that tree as a warning system. Whenever danger or threat to the peace were to approach, that eagle would screech and make a warning sound to the people to understand that trouble was on its way, and to take heed, and again to utilize that thinking of the great peace to counter that threat, whatever that may be. And this is just to fast forward about 800 years or thereabouts from that time. These are stories that our people shared with the colonists at the time, and people like Benjamin Franklin and John Adams and such. They would have been familiar with these stories because we often met with them. And these stories were huge influences on what became the American Constitution and the founding of America. So if you look today at the presidential seal of the United States, you see an eagle, and he has in one of its talons, I guess, an olive branch or a tree branch, and the other one is 13 arrows. And I didn't tell that part of the story. I'll get to it now, but going off script. But and the 13 arrows were, again, something lifted from the story I'm telling you, because is that one of the things that the peacemaker told all of our people when we assembled. Remember, we had 5 nations originally, And he said, each nation is an arrow. And you took an arrow and you snapped it, you broke it. And he said, but when you have 5 arrows bound together, 5 nations bound together, that's much more difficult to break. It'll bend, but it won't break. And he said that'll be the, a symbol of the unity of the 5 nations. Again, bow and arrow being something that our people would have used every day, and so would have understood these symbols and signs. So when this story was told to those American founders, they would have heard that. So if you look at the presidential seal of the United States, you see an eagle, which was, from our teachings, as well as those 13 arrows, which were the original 13 colonies. So those are, just a quick example of these intellectual traditions that we're not getting any copyright money for, but it's our influences on America and democracy in many, many ways at that time. So I'm mindful of time, but I do want to talk really quickly about the Turo Wampum, which is another teaching that a lot of people are familiar with, this idea of separate but equal, two vessels traveling down the river, the native people or Ungohoe indigenous people in one canoe, and the Western settlers and people in their sailing vessel. Was initially agreed upon with the Dutch, our people in the Dutch in 1613, and then later on with the French and the British when we came to be more of a relationship with them later on in the 17th century. And it's something you still see today. And it's this idea of sovereignty, and again, separate but equal, again, that because we have all of these things in our canoe, this idea that we recognize you as settlers in our country in the 17th century, and we're willing to work with you. We're willing to, if you enter into our thinking, and if you conduct yourself accordingly, peacefully in our lands, and we have a chance of getting along. And it worked out well for a while, but over time, these agreements were forgotten about. As Don talked about, it led to a lot of erosions and relationships, political relationships, the disrespect that was given to our women and to our ways, and the displacement of our people, taking our lands and resources, and all the things that we know about that have resulted in the things happening today. So, but the Turo is still something that we hold on to, as is all the other traditions that I'm talking about. Very, very important to us. And it was this traditional leadership that I'm talking about, the 50 chiefs that were put into place at the time of the peacemaker. And it was that traditional leadership that was governing this reserve here at Six Nations until 1924. It was still in operation when we moved here after the American Revolution in 1785. And that traditional leadership was taken over not taken over, but under orders from Ottawa. The RCMP came in and at gunpoint and basically said that the traditional leadership was no longer recognized in Canada. By Canada as the leadership here at Six Nations, and it was replaced with a band council system. Some people might have heard about that. And it's kind of caused a bit of a conflict in the community over time, but we've learned how to get along. But that's also part of that responsibility, right? But the Confederacy never went away. It has always upheld the teachings of the peacemaker, adapted it to our present day situations, whatever that may be. There's been a lot of changes, right? Obviously in the last 200, 300, 400 years, but it's still in place. That's the important thing. Like I said, that we're still talking about these things. And even though talk of the Great Peace was, in a lot of areas in the 20th century, after the First World War, people probably heard of the League of Nations. That was formed, right, in Geneva. And our people were cited as being a huge influence on that thinking. And then again, when the United Nations was formed in October 1945, the great law, the great peace of the Iroquois was also talked about back then. So it was, a story that was known, universally almost, except for here in North America. And I think that's, this whole idea of colonialism and capitalism taking place on our lands. If, our people had such, intellectual traditions, it would be socially unjust to take those things away, take our lands away from people with such a highly developed process of political thinking, So there's a lot of psychological things happening at play there with colonialism, and a lot of these things are coming forth today, and that's what Truth and Reconciliation is about. This idea that there's a longer narrative in this country, and it's not a pretty one, but it's one that needs an accounting now. And we're hearing about it weekly, daily almost now, and that's part of what the holiday tomorrow is about as well. So there's a lot to consider there, and yeah, I think I'll probably break it off there, because I know we still have some time for question and answer, and I know that part of this lecture series is about just that. So thank you for listening. Apologize if I went over, and I'll now turn it back over to, I think Gary will moderate us through the next little while. Okay, now everybody.
Thanks so much, Rick. And I'll just take 1 second to introduce Dr. Gary Warner. Gary Warner is a member of the Gandhi Lecture Committee. So he's the one who's going to moderate the Q&A. So please feel free to post your questions on the YouTube chat, and we will sort of circulate it to Gary. Thanks, Gary.
Thanks, Chandrima. So the first question is a technical question. So for an authoritative response, I'll refer that question to you, Chandrima. It is a question from Don. Will this video live stream be available later for viewing?
Yes, so the lecture, not all of the event, not all, the entire event, but the lecture will be available for viewing, and it will be posted along on the website for Global Peace and Social Justice. So if you just go to the GPSJ website, you will see a column called Gandhi Lecture Series, and along with the other lectures of the past, this one also will be included. So we just need some time to edit and put it up, but hopefully within 2 weeks' time, it should be available. Thank you.
Thanks, Chandrima. So our first substantive question is from Sally. It's addressed to Dr. Martin Hill. So Dawn, what are your tips on how we can do our part to uphold the Haudenosaunee and Gandhian laws, respecting the earth and avoiding materialism while living in a capitalistic society?
That's a big one. Thank you for that question. I actually will share. I left this slide because I didn't want to go over, but I actually have a science. Can you see the screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this was put together by natural scientists, and given we are speaking to university and students, I thought, the TRC calls to action they're solid, but a lot of them rely on government to handle it, and not so much giving people, everyday people, something, as particularly in this case students. And it's going to go right to the beginning. So this call to action, it was put together by scientists who, and I'm working in Haudenosaunee. I have multidisciplinary teams and engaging in the community. And I learned, hanging around engineers, which I never thought I would ever do in my life, but here I am. And I think always Harvey's probably behind this, because he wanted environment dealt with. And so I think, any research that I've come across, I see that engineers and natural scientists have gone around the world, and they take their students and they do amazing projects and they bring clean water, and I'm not saying don't go to Peru. Those are our brothers or sisters there, but, they've ignored next door. And here we had the Great Lakes region, the largest freshwater body in the world, one of the top 3. And in 200 years, it's been destroyed. And now you have people who have lived here not having access to clean water. So finding ways to do meaningful research, it has been kind of my mantra to the university. I've been talking to anybody who will listen and say, you know, like, we need help to preserve our environment. We need people to understand what's coming, which is, you know, climate crisis. It's no longer climate change. It's already changed. And First Nations aren't ready. They're not getting the same data and information that municipalities are. They're getting ready. You know, they understand there's going to be water shortages. They understand, you know, and our people are doing that in a grassroots way. But we still need to, you know, technology. We need partnerships. They're Nestle's taking all of our aquifer water. You know, we want to set up a water station in the community so that our people can go access clean, proper, untreated water, which is what the elders really think is our truest medicine. But we don't even have access to it. So one, don't buy from Nestle, please. And land back, understand, you know, my daughter, you know, went into the Nestle plant with a cease and desist from the Confederacy, and I was terrified. And my son has been on the front lines at Standing Rock and terribly abused, terribly traumatized by what was happening and how they were being treated. And people need to help stand with us, because I'm like, you know, we're already getting the worst end of violence that you can imagine, and missing and murdered women and so on. And then we have to take on this responsibility that our young people, who I love and I don't want harmed or arrested or brutalized, you know, having to be on the front lines. But if our allies and settlers vote in the right people, please, and also work with us to resolve these issues so that our good energy isn't wasted on protesting. We need your help in every conceivable way. But for research, I put this up because this is a way that scientists can do a call to action, and do training. I've had to train all of 40 some graduate students from engineering every time they come to Six Nations, and it's kind of not fair. That's our job as the Indigenous people, that we have to train every grad student, every student. We need them to come and test water and help us, but you know, universities need to take up some of that burden, and they'll do it if their faculty and if their students request it. Also, we need ecological courses. This is what Harvey always wanted. This is what he envisioned. This is what I worked towards, to honor the elders. And I have yet to get that course or courses up and running. And I can tell you, students want these courses. They want preparedness. They want food security. So I just feel like those are things that could move quicker if we had a lot more support. But right now it's not happening. And we need more people to step up in this way, like these scientists did. And I did send this to the president and to the VPR and anywhere else that would listen, so they could help us.
Okay, thank you, Dawn, for that reply. It's a very thoughtful and comprehensive reply. Our next question is addressed to Rick, and it's from our host, Chandrima. What would be, Rick, what would be the model for conflict resolution according to Haudenosaunee traditions? What would be the model for conflict resolution according to Haudenosaunee traditions?
Yeah, another simple one. Yeah, I think basically, I think a lot of listening and thought and consideration has been mentioned. Any decision we make would be, you know, what are the benefits for 7 generations in the future? What are the benefits for, you know, our children's children, or the negative consequences of the decisions that we make or are being made or being talked about? And conflict resolution in these cases is pretty broad. I don't know if we're talking at like an individual level or a smaller level, or let's use Land Back Lane as an example, because that's a conflict that's happening, you know, right now currently in our backyard. And I think there has to be a lot of dialogue and understanding. And what I see for the most part is that most Canadians politicians do not want to engage with the real narrative of this country. So I think there has to be a lot of homework done, a lot of research done first. If they understood some of the history of what we're claiming, that goes back to the Haldeman deed that brought us here in 1784, back to the Turo, back to all of these things, and the moral responsibility we have as Haudenosaunee people to the the natural resources around us, including water, as Don was talking about. There has to be kind of understanding. If there's not an equal understanding of our history, our shared history, it's much more harder to resolve that conflict. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done on behalf of the settlers, for instance. And I think that's kind of what the holiday tomorrow is about. I think if people spent those interested folks would spend time reading up on this history to come up to speed on that. So I think that would be my quick answer to that. But certainly those mechanisms are built into what's known as the Great Law or the Great Peace, that the two sides come together. There's lots of councils and consideration. And if you look at the historical record, there were a lot of recorded accounts of these meetings that go back to the 17th century about how they were resolving conflict amongst people, European nations and our nations, even our nations amongst ourselves. We met in these great councils and talked and debated. It would take days and weeks sometimes. There's these recorded moments of these such meetings when the I guess the colonists or the Europeans who were over expressed a lot of frustration for the time it took to get an answer out of Native people, right? Because there was a lot to consider. You just couldn't come up in the 9 to 5. Well, we got to go for dinner now. Let's make a decision. It didn't work that way because they put a lot of careful consideration into their responses. So we have to get back to that somehow. I don't know if we're ever going to be able to, but it's the work that lies ahead. So
Thanks, Rick. And our next question is really a follow-up on that previous question. It's from Catherine Graham. Hello, Catherine. And the question is, how can we learn more about the peacemaker and the great peace? And I guess it's addressed to both speakers. Maybe Dawn should go first.
I think there's quite a bit of literature out there, and I think Rick and I could probably put together a course. We'd love to teach a graduate course. We've not been able to at McMaster. I taught my first one after 28 years. I think that's, training the next generation. But I think all courses across the campus and public should have the teachings of our people here, which the world elite know about, but the average citizen doesn't, which is a shame, because our prophecy that Rick was talking about, the elders stood at McMaster and said, the roots of peace are supposed to spread in all directions, and any nation could come under the rafters, and it was stopped during that time I was talking about. And I've always believed what the elders told me, which is that day will come when they will come and they will ask to come under the tree of peace. So I can't see it, but they could see much farther than I've ever been able to. So I believe and have that hope that people will learn. There's a lot of Indigenous Studies courses that Rick and I or others teach that it's interwoven into every class, regardless of what we're teaching. So I think supporting Indigenous Studies and Indigenous content would be really helpful, because I'm exhausted. It's been a long battle, as Gary, my good colleague there from way back, knows. There was 2 of us in 2 offices, and it's been a long haul at MAC.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It has been a long haul, but you're still there.
They haven't got rid of me yet.
Did you want to add anything to that, Rick?
Sure, real quickly. There's a couple of, I was just going to say, well, you can Google it, Catherine, like everybody else finds information these days, but be careful, as you know. But I'm just being facetious. A couple of pretty solid, reliable sources that are easily attainable in text form. One is called The White Roots of Peace by Paul Wallace. That was written in the late 40s, early 50s. And it's just a short accounting of the story of the peacemaker, which I talked about, written at the time of the formation of the United Nations. And also a book called Basic Call to Consciousness, which is also available through Amazon. I think both these things should be, or even Mills Library. Those are pretty good accounts, and there's many more, much longer ones, largely written by non-natives, but many by native people too, that tell this longer story. There's also a book that came out recently by Paul Williams, who's a lawyer who's worked with Six Nations for the last 30 or 40 years, called, I should know this, sorry Paul if you're listening, I think it's just called The Great Law of Peace, but it's Paul Williams. That's also recent and a really nice study of some of the things that I was talking about this evening. So yeah, things are out there.
Rick, this next question is for you, from Serena. It's a factual question, just out of curiosity. How many wampum laws are there?
Well, that's a good question. Hundreds. We know about some of the more famous ones, the two-a-row and the dish with one spoon, for instance. Even the dish with one spoon was pretty obscure until quite recently with the land acknowledgement business. The Hiawatha belt that we've been talking about. But yeah, dozens, hundreds of these agreements, big and small, have taken place, pre-contact. That's the way our ancestors made agreements with other indigenous nations in this area, mostly the Northeast, and then many, many more with settlers as well. And one thing I did want to add really quickly, with regard to the Hiawatha belt, the Five Nations belt, whatever you want to call it, that Don referred to, if you notice, I don't have one here with me close by, but if you notice that image, that path, that line extends right to the edges of that belt. It's not meant to stop with those Five Nations. It's meant to expand. Like I said, we're a very inclusive people, and again, we share these things, and we're happy to coexist with others. It was never intended to just stop with the 5 or 6 nations. It was always open, because this was such important, fundamentally changing, fundamental change that could be brought about, for global, kind of acceptance, if people so chose. It wasn't forced on anybody, but it was there if one wanted to participate. So I just wanted to make that point real quick. Well, which wasn't quick at all, sorry.
Okay, so we still have a couple of more questions. This one is about Bill C-15. So Bill C-15 received royal assent. What do you think the government needs to do in order to implement it well? Are there any concerns regarding the bill? Either or both speakers.
I'm waiting for Don. Which one is Bill C-15?
That's the UNDRIP, but they kind of gutted the core sovereignty principles of it. It's better than what we have right now. That's my position, and that's just my position. Others are very set against it, and have campaigns explaining how it watered down UNDRIP and really didn't give us the true authority to manage our lands and our resources. So it's problematic, but from where I stand, it's better than just having the Indian Act. So yes, of course, the government's handling it, and of course there's problems. But it is a move in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would just add to that really quickly too. It's ironic in a way, like as I was saying, the great law of peace had a very prominent role to play in the formation of the United Nations, to thinking about this collective formation of nations coming together to sort of work through issues of mutual benefit and peace in the wake of 2 world wars, that our people would be left out of such basic human rights as to have our sovereignty back when these nations were involved with, retaining those and upholding those, global justice while denying us ours. And though we helped that thinking along back then, but so it goes.
Mhm. So our next question, so where do you draw the line? Where is the line where we can learn about and familiarize ourselves with Indigenous culture to gather a deeper understanding and respect, but without culturally appropriating? Where is that line? Where do you?
So I teach the spirituality course, which is always controversial, but our curriculum was developed by people like Hubert Buck and Harvey Longboat and Reg Henry, and they wanted spirituality taught. Nobody wanted to teach it, so I ended up with it. And the issue is you can appreciate the beauty and the teachings and take away from those teachings. You cannot have it. It does not belong to anyone outside of the heritage people who hold that. So Haudenosaunee. So it's about owning and controlling, which is what happened with our great law and everything, our medicines, our engineering, our science, all was appropriated. And then we were not giving credit, and it was changed when it was taken away from the foundation, because here you have checks and balances. People will correct me in a drop of a hat, and they'll tell me when I go to the store, we saw this and we don't, so you really have people watching you. Whereas if somebody removes it from that foundation, they change it and the essence of it. So it's best to appreciate it, understand it, so that you understand, why didn't we accept almost $100 million for a few acres near Caledonia? We need the money. We need a waste treatment plant. We need a lot of things, but we need the land more. And so they're not going to understand how we make legal decisions, or why the Sioux have over $1 billion sitting in the US trust, because they don't want to sell their sacred sites, the Black Hills. But yet they're poor. So people don't understand why we make decisions, but we make them based on our spiritual foundation. So understanding our spirituality is critical to understanding how we make decisions today, why we're willing to get arrested for something, that others might feel isn't that important. There's other issues to worry about. So I think that's important. You cannot own it and control it, represent it. It's just for your own personal growth and understanding. And if you come from that place of respect, then we greatly appreciate it, and we're happy to share.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and our final question from Juana: what should we do when people are unwilling to listen? The Great Peace, from my understanding, required that all 5 nations listen to the peacemaker. So what should we do when people are unwilling to listen? So there's a challenge for you. Rick,
Go
you
ahead,
want to
Rick.
go?
Sure.
Go ahead, Rick. Take that one.
It's a great question. I think the thinking there is that those who are, because I'm thinking there's a lot of talk about these days about vaccines, let's say, and there's this kind of divide, but I almost sort of see it as being, again, it's modeled by the leaders, and Mr. Trump in the States had a lot to do with that. There's a lot of pushback, so you can see that kind of bubbling up, right? This kind of confrontational thinking. So it would seem to me to follow with the tenets of the Great Law is that those who are willing to listen, those who are engaging with it thoughtfully, just have to model that kind of behavior. And it's all about how those things are framed. It's often said that our people, all Indigenous people were remarkable orators, because they were able to stand in front of a crowd of people and convince them, not tell them what to do, but to kind of show them urge them and encourage them and always be kind of open to listening to other points of view while using, good sound thinking to always kind of want to encourage people to want to help their fellow, human being. And it kind of boils down to that. And as I was saying earlier, this would take a long time. It didn't happen in a half-hour speech. It would take a very long time. And it said that when the peacemaker formulated this great peace amongst the people, it took years. I talked about it in 10 minutes, but it took years to accomplish. It wasn't that easy. And that's the thing, is there's a lot of hard work goes into making people listen, because people are going to have different opinions, and they always will, and that's okay. But it's the collective good-mindedness of people, and it's a constant reminding each other, because even the opening address that Elin spoke of, that refrain, so it be in our minds. It's a reminder all the time to always use that thinking. And from the time you're a little baby to the time you're an old person, you've heard that thing thousands of times, that opening address, and it's always that repetitive nature. You have to always be thinking, always listening, always have your ears open. So what the hon sios, that means listen carefully. That's always in our speeches. So we know that, like I said earlier, human beings are forgetful creatures, and we kind of think we know more than we do, but we always need to be reminded to think and to listen and to help each other. So I think that's how I think that's part of how you make people listen. It's harder and harder these days. There's a lot of buzz out there. Internet, social media. It's even becoming harder for human beings to comprehend what is useful information and what is not so helpful. But I think that's my answer for now. Thanks.
Yeah, I would just add to that the step in the direction that I've seen with different sports teams and outreach by hospitals, wearing orange, Niagara Falls. And I've seen people that I was with burst into tears, because this is a pain that they've carried silently. And when you carry that pain silently and you can't express it openly and you can't talk your truth openly, it wears you down as a human being. And that's why we're sickly people. And that's why no matter what they do, the health doesn't improve. And I believe this will probably do more for Indigenous health and all the programs and services that are thrown at us, because we've carried this pain. And a part of the Peacemaker's teachings, the original ones, when he came on upon Hiawatha, who was in great grief, losing all his daughters. And the first step was to heal him so that he could speak clearly, see clearly. And that teaching is incredibly important. And I think what tomorrow is about and moving forward is our people need to see that they're finally being seen, especially the survivors. And when you do activities, like for us, it's song, it's dance, it's art, it's making beautiful things together. That's where the heart of the piece is. And because we're separate and we don't do those things together in the way that we should, this is our country. Where's our museums? Where's our art centers? We're lucky if we get asked to go to one and exhibit one little thing. So the more we begin to share our culture in a real way at universities and other institutions, the more likely peace is achievable. But right now, it's been so hostile for us as a professor, as a student. The epistemological violence we'd experience every day and microaggressions does make you unwell, and it doesn't make you in the mood to be giving and peaceful. So there has to be healing, which is a foundational law, if you will, principle of the great law, was to heal yourself first so that you can truly be a leader. And that's kind of what's missing.
So thanks for the questions, which have really helped to expand on the lectures, leaving us with the note of the great peace. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary.
Thanks
Nice
so much. Oops, Dawn, go ahead.
I just said nice to see Gary. I haven't seen him in a long time.
I know, but we'll see you on Saturday again.
Saturday again, yeah.
So thank you both for your responses, and I will now invite Ellen Henhock again now to offer some closing words for us so that we might be able to go in peace. Ellen, can you please unmute? Yeah.
There you are. We can't see you though.
Let's see.
The camera at the bottom.
Can you guys hear me? I'm trying
We
to.
can hear you. Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to say the closing address for the conference tonight. So, done and done. You can go down. Just what I'm seeing you. Ska go and go eat so what don't. Ne hanjid way what can to. So go eat some. So go a week and on you. Ne always at scan out. We're not the new. It didn't end way hig. He has Scott hanjid way ya. I'm going to go hot. Scott and Jordan on you. It again your tongue. Going to go hot. Done you ne hanjid what show we. Someone's a gift, but no hot. Now there's one home quat. Scott did not get no say go wait no ni. On again again. Those 18 horn you. 18 hot ones again. Then go and see the Gandraco. They go turn it. Nag way go send ye hot. And it's again your tongue. Going to go hot. Done you ne. Ne hanjid what show we. Ne send you. Hoday hondan you. Gini can go again. We focus on go home. Eight nights ago here dog get touch nigga. Snash and how in and hit. And we hate the Scott did not get us. I go wait no ni. On again again those 18 honyo. Those are don't know honyo go to. And send you. Hoday hondan you. That again your tongue. Going to go home. Da one don't want go di. Ne hanjid what show we. Kenyan go doggy. I don't hear cure no. They can it you can't you don't. They go ne scan no. Ne do not you. They didn't egg any quack again. They go going go did the go strong. Da and we hate the hona say go hona didn't again. Scott didn't again to say those I go wait no ni on again again. Those 18 honyo. Kenyan go doggy. Ne I don't hear cure no. It's again your tongue. Going to go on. Da hona don't want go di. Ne and did what show we. And it's to go on. Ne ask na day yo. Oi ho on again. The hodan again they touch the hawk but that. Kadogas and your shaggy hold when a show we going again hand draw. Da and we hate the honadi and again Scott knows I go we no ni. On again and again those said one on you should go on and ask on a day you. It's again your tongue going to go on. Da on that on what guadi then I handed what show we. To get home, shake your production home town when Jadi going again hand draw. Why don't I ask why this song? They got it now, it's an on that near song to sack on the scan or nanga had nothing you. Had if ni shaggy, had the Sunday, had the only nanga and go in a huggy, the hoda nanga had any down shot. Da and we higgy on again nanga, no say go away no ni. On again nanga, no said one on you, go here, Hanagi, nice away this song, it again your tongue, but go home. Da to the nanga, no what way ni. Ike guadi ne hagaya tak ne hagri on hold on ne wa ne sunda de da ne de ne ne te tiwa ne kenyang guadagi hadon ya kyo no egwe gon scan no hoson ki atation hon kin go again draw kan go hon ho hondo nyo kisan nga ne guadawani ho da na de nga hanga gwe ne handwa ka songo ho ne go so da te de nga na governor kan he da ne to.
Thank you, Ellen. Rick, can I just maybe invite you just to give us a translation? A short one. I know it's not possible for you to, of course, translate everything, but just so that many of us who don't speak the language, get a sense of the thoughts.
Yeah, sure. So Elon just kind of went over again what he did earlier. Once again, thanking the people for coming out tonight, and it's good to see everyone. And as a group of people, we'll give thanks and acknowledgement again to Mother Earth and all the assigned helpers that are upholding their responsibilities every day for our benefit. He went on to thank the four guardians, the four beings that help us in our travels on this earth and keep us safe and protect our minds. And he thanked our leader, Skanyadayo, Handsome Lake, who gave us a message of how to be in the world 200 and something years ago, when our lives were transformed after colonialism and the American Revolution, and we still uphold those principles today. And he ended with the creator, Sangwa Diso, he who made our bodies. And for him, we are indebted for everything, and we acknowledge and thank him for all that he's done. And then again, at the end, he releases our minds from our assigned task this evening, and wishes us safe travels home, although most of us are at home, I guess, now. So yeah, it's just to kind of like, I guess, put closure to the evening and thank everybody, and remember the words that were shared tonight.
Thank you so much for that, Rick. So I will just, add to Ilan's, and thank you everyone for joining us today, and especially our invited speakers. And hopefully we can take Dawn's and Rick's invitation to learn, educate, and act, not just this week, but in the days, months, years, and decades ahead of us. So thank you everyone, and I hopefully see you next year, and hopefully I will see everyone at the lecture in person in a room. And not in little Zoom boxes. So have a good night. And thank you once again, Dr. Rick Montier and Dr. Dawn Martin-Hill for graciously answering all the questions and for, educating us. So thank you.
Yeah, see you Saturday.
Yeah, and for those of you who are still around, please consider attending the Gandhi Peace Festival on Saturday. It's also going to be a virtual event. So the Zoom link is being, shared. So please, and Dawn Martin-Hill is speaking there. So please consider attending that event, which is also being held virtually. Thank you so much, and everybody have a good night.
And good to see everyone. Good to see you, Dawn and Rick.
Yeah, it was nice. I wish we would have been together in a room.
That was the original plan. We were to have dinner together.
Yeah, I remember those things. I think I was invited to a few Gandhi dinners, and I was looking forward to it. And another time.
Another
Just
time.
happy to be alive.
Next year.
That's right.
Thanks.
Okay.
Bye.
Have a good
Thank you,
evening.
Pamela.
Thanks, Chandrima.